Once upon a time, in a small village surrounded by mountains and a river, where the crystal-clear waters reflected the stars of the night, there was a woman named Maria. Her story was woven with mystery and pain, a legend passed from mouth to mouth, from grandparents to the youngest. Over the years, people began to whisper with fear about the presence of the woman who walked along the riverbanks, with empty eyes and a gaunt face, crying inconsolably. Maria was a young woman with beautiful jet-black hair and deep eyes that reflected the sadness of a broken soul. She had been born in the same village, in a humble adobe house, where she had always felt the love of a mother and the protection of her father. In her youth, her life seemed full of promise. She was known for her beauty, but also for her kindness, her contagious laughter, and her noble heart. One day, a man arrived in the village. He was tall, with a penetrating gaze and a deep voice, who over time captivated Maria's heart. His name was Alonso. He was a man from distant lands who had traveled far and wide, and his life seemed to be an enigma in itself. They quickly fell in love, as if destiny had united them forever. Maria and Alonso lived a romance so intense that it seemed like something out of a fairy tale. But what began as a story of sincere love soon turned into something much darker. At first, Alonso seemed to be a charming man. He promised eternal love to Maria, and over time, the young woman gave herself completely to him. As the months passed, they married, and happiness seemed to have touched their door. Maria became pregnant with their first child, and joy filled their home. The family prepared for the arrival of their little one, but something in the air changed. People began to notice that Alonso was no longer the same. His behavior became distant, his gaze colder. He often arrived home late, and sometimes he wouldn't return for days. Young Maria could not understand what was happening to her husband. She worried about him, but in her heart, a dark voice whispered that something was not right. During her pregnancy, tensions between them grew. Every time Alonso returned home, he felt more distant, as if something was consuming him from the inside. Maria, although anxious, tried to stay calm, holding on to the hope that her husband's love would return with the arrival of their child. The night their son was born, the atmosphere was charged with tension. The baby's cry echoed through the walls of the house, while the wind howled outside, as if nature itself were foretelling what was about to happen. Maria rose, exhausted but happy, to see the face of her little one, a child with the same dark eyes as his father. However, the emotion that filled the mother was overshadowed by Alonso's coldness. Upon seeing the child, his expression was empty, with no hint of joy or surprise. Maria, although bewildered, thought that perhaps the exhaustion and the previous tensions explained her husband's attitude. But that night, Alonso did not stay at the house. He left, without saying a word, leaving Maria alone with her newborn. Hours passed, then days, but Alonso did not return. Desperate, Maria went out in search of him, walking along the lonely paths that surrounded the village. What Maria found the next day marked the beginning of the tragedy. Alonso was by the river, sitting on the shore, watching the waters flow with an unsettling calm. When Maria approached him, his face showed an empty expression, as if he were no longer present in the world around him. His mind had been lost in some darkness that Maria could not understand. The young woman asked him what had happened, why he had been so distant, but Alonso did not respond. In a cold and calculated gesture, he simply stood up and walked away, disappearing into the thickness of the night. That same night, while Maria tried to comfort her baby, sadness enveloped her like a heavy cloak. She didn't understand how, from being a man full of love, Alonso had changed so radically. Loneliness began to weigh heavily on her, and although her baby needed her, her heart was filled with uncertainty and fear. What had she done wrong for her husband to distance himself from her? What had failed? The next day, the situation worsened. Maria, filled with fear and anguish, noticed something unsettling in her son's eyes. As if the baby too sensed the darkness that had taken over the house, Something in his gaze seemed more mature than what should have been for his young age. Once again, the waters of the river seemed to call her, and a dark thought began to cloud Maria's mind. What if the love she had sought in Alonso no longer existed? What if, like the river, everything in her life was starting to overflow and disappear? What no one knew at that moment was that Maria's tragedy was not only beginning, but that fate had an even more bitter lesson in store. Something inside her began to break. A feeling of desperation, of abandonment, began to consume her. But what came next changed the lives of everyone in the village forever. It is still unknown how, but that very night, when the stars seemed to hide behind the clouds, a shadow began to move through the village. And her cry, filled with pain and desperation, began to be heard from the deepest depths of the darkness. At first, Maria's cry was soft, but it increased in intensity as the days went by. No one in the village understood what was happening to her, but everyone felt that something sinister was brewing. No one dared to get too close to her home, as something in the air had changed. The atmosphere became heavy and dark every time someone passed near the riverbank, where she used to walk. Whispers about what was happening to Maria became more frequent and filled with fear. Meanwhile, the young mother struggled with her own inner demons. She had stopped sleeping. Her mind was trapped between happy memories and the growing shadow of despair. Each day seemed more unbearable, and time became a burden. Sometimes, when looking at her son, she thought of Alonso's broken promises, of the joy they once shared, of the days that seemed so distant and happy. But soon, the happy memories were replaced by sadness and anger. As the days passed, Maria began to show signs that her sanity was crumbling. The pain of Alonso's disappearance, combined with the fear of not being able to care for her son alone, made her lose touch with reality. She spent hours walking along the riverbank, staring at the fast-moving waters, as if the answers she sought could be hidden in its depths. Every time the young mother looked at the river, she saw something that attracted her strongly, something that called to her. It was as if a voice from the deepest waters whispered in her ear, telling her that it would all end if she just gave herself to the river. The relationship between Maria and her son also began to turn strange. Although her maternal instinct had not disappeared, something in her had changed. The baby's cries, which at first were comforting, began to make her uncomfortable. She got up later and later from her bed, with glassy eyes and a distant air, as if she could no longer hear the joy that a child should bring. In her heart, hope slowly extinguished. She felt trapped, as if her life were bound to tragedy and misery, with no way out. She didn't know what to do to regain her life, and the thought of losing her child, as she had lost Alonso, began to torment her. Her love for her little one began to dissolve under the tide of a despair that consumed her. No one was close to help her. In the darkness of the night, she found herself alone, with memories and shadows that would not let her escape. On one of those nights, when the full moon shone brightly in the sky, Maria made a decision that would change her life and that of everyone in the village forever. She got up, walked toward the river, and stopped at the shore. The wind blew strongly, as if nature itself wanted to prevent her from doing what she was about to do, but she didn't stop. She looked at the flowing waters, with the constant and eternal sound of the river, and felt that there, she would find peace, that the darkness of the water would embrace her and, perhaps, her sorrows would fade away forever. With her heart racing, she took a few more steps until she reached the water, as if she had no fear. Suddenly, something changed within her. A voice whispered in her ear, as if it were Alonso, as if it were the river itself calling her. The young mother, without thinking, began to walk toward the water. As she did so, something in her soul told her that what she was doing was wrong, but despair was stronger than her reasoning. When she reached the water, she raised her arms, as if surrendering to fate. At that moment, a loud noise shook her from her thoughts. A desperate cry, the cry of her son, pierced her heart. Instinctively, Maria looked back toward her home and saw the figure of her son in the door, watching her with eyes full of fear. Something in her heart awakened at that instant. and a flood of love for him overwhelmed her. Suddenly, the pain from Alonso's absence and the sense of hopelessness she had felt for so long dissipated for a moment. But at the very same instant, another presence rose within her. The same pain that had tormented her began to return with more force, and the river, as if enraged, seemed to rise in waves that surrounded her. Maria, confused and fighting against the voices in her mind, began to step back, but something stopped her. The water engulfed her, and she felt an emptiness in her chest, as if everything were falling apart. With a heart-breaking scream, Maria stepped back and, in her desperation, fell into the water. But it was not a regular fall. It was a fall that seemed to have no end. The water began to swallow her, and she struggled to get out, but she couldn't. The cries of her son faded in the wind. At that moment, everything in her body froze. When the sun began to rise on the horizon, there was no trace of Maria. No one saw her again. No one could understand how it happened, but the whispers in the village said that the young mother had disappeared, swallowed by the river. What the people didn't know was that her cry would never cease, and that her soul, marked by suffering, would remain trapped forever in the waters, searching for her son endlessly. From that moment, the nights grew quieter, but a presence was felt in the air. The villagers began to hear a distant cry, a wail that came from the river, as if the mother searched for her child without rest. No one dared to approach the water, for it was said that anyone who did could hear the wail of the weeping woman, a cry that froze the soul. The village, once a peaceful place filled with laughter, began to bear the mark of Maria's tragedy. The crying, which some claimed to hear at night, became a constant presence in everyone's minds. No one could escape the echo of her suffering, and the elders, those who had lived long enough to know the old legends, whispered among themselves, recalling the warnings about the fury of spirits who cannot find peace. The river, once a source of life and sustenance for the villagers, now seemed marked by a dark destiny. The summer days, when the waters turned clear and warm, turned into somber afternoons. Families began to avoid the riverbanks, and some brave young people who tried to defy the stories about the weeping woman found themselves encountering an inexplicable presence. The cold waters, the chill wind that blew for no reason, or even the echoes of a muffled wail that seemed to come from all directions. Generations grew up with fear of the river, and with each new child born, the elders told them the story of the woman who had lost her sanity and life for her lost love. However, as it happens with all legends, the stories became distorted over time. For many, the weeping woman became a figure of terror, a monster of the darkness. For others, she was a soul trapped between love and despair, seeking redemption, a reflection of human suffering that transcends death. On the coldest nights, the cries of the wail became clearer. Sometimes, those who lived near the river said they could hear the sound of water breaking against the rocks, followed by a low lament, as if someone were crying from the bottom of the river. Others said that during moonless nights, they could see a white figure on the shore, walking through the fog, searching the waters for what she had already lost. Her face was indescribable, often illuminated by the silver light of the moon, and her eyes, empty and full of suffering, reflected a despair that seemed to have no end. As the years passed, Maria's story transformed into a legend that was told in every corner of the village. Parents scared their children with stories of the weeping woman, warning them not to approach the river at night, not to disobey the rules, or the ghostly woman would come for them. Over time, the figure of the weeping woman transcended Maria's story, and many nearby villages began to speak of her. Everywhere, it was told that if someone encountered her cry in the darkness, they would never be the same again. Some claimed that those who dared to follow the cry would disappear forever, while others said that the weeping woman took the souls of those who heard her, taking them to the river so that they would never rest again. The torment of Maria did not remain confined to the legend. It was said that her spirit, burdened with eternal anguish, had become trapped between the world of the living and the dead, as if she could not find peace or redemption. In the village, some attempted rituals to calm her spirit, but they always failed. It was believed that Maria's soul could never find rest until she reunited with her son. But life was no longer so simple. Her suffering had corrupted her being to such an extent that there was no hope of redemption. The death of Alonso, although unclear, became another mystery in the story of the young mother. No one knew if he had been consumed by the same fate as her, if he had disappeared from her life by his own will, or if, perhaps, he had met a tragic end elsewhere. What was certain is that Maria's anguish grew with the idea that he would never return, and that her son, who had once been the reason for her life, was also lost forever. When darkness and madness took hold of her soul, Maria ceased to be the loving woman she had once been. She became the mother who wept for the loss of her children, not just the physical one, but the soul, a broken soul that could not find peace in the realm of the living or the dead. Years passed, and generations changed, but the weeping woman remained part of the local culture. No one dared approach the river after nightfall, fearing that the mother's cry would lose control, that the woman with the sorrowful face would drag them into the cold waters, where their souls would be trapped forever. Fear and respect for the legend became a way of life for the villagers. No one wanted to risk encountering the spirit of the broken woman who had never been able to find solace. Today, the story of the weeping woman remains alive in every corner where the river flows. It is told to children and reminded to adults. No one knows exactly when the legend began, but everyone agrees that it is a reminder of human suffering, of lost love, of the despair that can consume a human being, and of the eternal desire for redemption that is never achieved. Though many try to forget it, the cry remains the echo of a dark past, resonating on moonless nights. And so, Maria, the young mother who once dreamed of happiness, became a wandering soul, condemned to roam the banks of the river for all eternity. Her pain turned into her sentence, and her cry into a warning. Love and despair are powerful forces that can drag any human being into perdition. The weeping woman is no longer just a story. It is a perpetual reminder of what happens when the heart is lost in darkness, when love turns into obsession, and when suffering finds no solace. The fate of Maria, like that of so many lost souls, became part of folklore, and her cry will continue to echo forever, as the waters of the river continue to flow, carrying with them not only the leaves and stones, but also the shadows of those who dare to hear her call.